Well, Alan, thanks for having us in today. Wonderful garage, wonderful cars.
Yeah, well, thank you for coming. It's always fun to share my interests with other people.
It's a privilege. Now, we're going to be talking about Rolls-Royce today, of course, your Silver Ghost. But I'm curious where your car fascination started.
Started when I was about 10 years old, and I got a little plastic model of a 1914 Stutz Bearcat, and then I finished that one, and then I got another one, and pretty soon I had a whole collection of early cars. And then I started reading books on early cars, and there weren't very many in those days. And so my interest expanded from there. And then when I was 14, I used to ride my bicycle by a place that had some old cars, and there was a 1924 Rio sedan that sat in the driveway. One day I decided I'm going to stop and see if that car's for sale. And I went and knocked on the door, and I looked like I was about 12 years old, even though I was 14. And the man said, well, yes, I'll sell the car. And so I bought it and went home and told my dad I needed him to drive a car home for me that I had just bought. And then it went downhill from there. And the next car was a 1917 Dodge. And I started buying and selling early cars, trying to find an even earlier one than what I had.
Now, do you remember what you paid for those cars?
Yes, I paid $50 for the Rio and $25 for the Dodge. This was in the 1956, and cars weren't worth a whole lot at that time.
And did either of them run?
Yes, they did. And
well,
that's
a
why
bonus.
I was able to have my dad drive them home, even though I wasn't old enough to drive.
And I suppose he took the news well that you had bought these cars?
Well, it was a little bit of a surprise when I first told him that I'd bought the Rio. He seemed to accept it all right, and the next Saturday we went and got it, and he drove it home, and I started learning about cars. And just an ignorant kid, I didn't know anything about them, except I knew the engine was in there, and the pistons went up and down, and a few other things. And so I began to learn a lot about cars after that, hands-on experience.
And you were always interested in the early cars, as opposed to a lot of teenagers, they want a hot rod or they want the latest and greatest, maybe a Corvette or something, but that wasn't for you.
Well, most of my friends were into hot rods, and I was interested in those too, but I think it was because I wanted something different from what the rest of the kids had. And that's why I kind of leaned towards early cars. And having done the plastic models, that inspired me to take a greater interest in that area. And right away I joined the Horseless Carriage Club, and at that time that was the only car club around. And they all were into earlier cars, and the older the better. And they toured a lot, and they did a lot of driving. And when I got my driver's license, I had the Dodge, and I drove it to horseless carriage events and became more and more active in it as time went on. And then I got some of my friends interested in it, and pretty soon there was a pretty good group of us young guys that were into early cars. So we expanded from there. And then as time went on, I wanted to get better cars. And then when I got out of high school, I bought a 1912 SGV, which was a Lancia built under license here in the U.S.
Interesting. Like a Lambda or
no, it was before that, pre-Lambdas.
Right.
It was like the first model Lancias. And it was a high-quality car, and I didn't know much about them, but I learned. And it kind of expanded from there.
Now, are you surprised at the resurgence of interest in, say, pre-World War I cars these days? I'm seeing a lot more interest, and I think it has to do, my theory, of course, I think it has to do with the fact that we're surrounded by high technology all the time, and we're really removed from the mechanical stuff. And so I think people, when they see it, it's fascinating to them.
Well, cars are simple. They're easy to understand in the real early cars. Where cars today, you raise the hood up and you look under there and you've got all of these shields and different electronic gadgets, and you wonder, well, which piece is the engine? And the early cars, they're simple and easy to understand. And I think that people are looking for something that they don't have to concentrate on a whole lot. And of course, there's people that like all of that technology. But then there's people that are looking for an easier path to understand what's going on.
Yeah.
And I think that's one of the things that inspired me about Rolls-Royce. When I was about 30 years old, I met a gentleman who had some early Rolls-Royces, and he introduced me to a woman whose husband had passed away and left her with 4 Silver Ghosts. And she was looking for somebody to kind of take care of the cars for her. And by that time, I knew quite a bit about cars in general, and she had a 1909 Rolls-Royce, a fairly early Silver Ghost. And I went, and the car hadn't run in a while, and I checked everything out, and I thought, well, I can start this car. And it was a hand crank car. It didn't have a starter on it. And it wasn't long, and I had the thing running, and then I decided, well, let's take it out and drive it around. And it was a great experience, and that really stimulated my interest in Rolls-Royce.
Do you remember what year that was, by the way?
That was 1972 or 73. I can't remember exactly. But
And what was a Silver Ghost worth at that point, do you think?
well, that car was probably worth about $10,000 at the time.
Okay, so not a small sum of money in that year.
No, but it wasn't a huge amount of money either.
Right. I would say, well, a new Cadillac would have cost you about $5,500 then, I think.
Probably.
So, yeah. Interesting.
Well, this car was probably worth more because it was such an early car.
Right.
And there weren't a whole lot of survivors of real early Silver Ghosts.
Right. So you got into Rolls-Royce, and one thing that I like is that you really use your cars. They're not garage queens.
No. I enjoy driving cars. I'm not one to do a lot of restoration work, and I'm not big on going to car shows and standing around and letting people ooh and ah what a gorgeous car it is. And I already know that. And I don't have to prove it to anybody, but I do enjoy sitting behind the wheel and going down the road and looking at the scenery and just enjoying the feel of the car and the sounds that it makes and the way it handles on the road. And that's what I really enjoy about it.
Well, for people who don't really know the history of Rolls-Royce, maybe you could just give us a little thumbnail sketch of the early years of the company.
Well, the company started off a guy named Charles Rolls, whose family had quite a bit of money, and he was a sportsman, and he was into all kinds of cars, and he became a car dealer in England, and he's imported cars from France, which were the superior cars at the time. And then somebody says, well, you need to meet a guy named Henry Royce. And they set up a meeting in Manchester, and the two got along fairly well. And Rolls was interested in seeing a car that Royce had built, and they went to look at it, and the car was very quiet and smooth. And Rolls says, well, you know, I'd like to sell these cars. And so through a long chain of events, they became partners and started the company Rolls-Royce.
Now, Charles Rolls, as I recall, he was a car dealer about 1895, 96.
Started late 1890s. I'm not sure exactly what year it was when he first started.
And Henry Royce's first car was the 10 horsepower?
The first car he built was a 10 horsepower two-cylinder.
Right.
And then they soon came out with a 4-cylinder, which was the 20 horsepower Rolls. And that was a very popular car, and Charles Rolls entered competitions with those cars and did very well with them because they were lightweight, very reliable, performed well, and won a number of different competitions.
So the quality and the reliability and the engineering was there from the start?
Yes.
Now, one of the sort of curious things about Rolls-Royce is that they are named often by their horsepower.
Yes. The 20 was the first 4-cylinder, and that was the one that became the most common one. They didn't build a whole lot of 2-cylinder cars, which was the 10 horsepower. And then in 1906, they came out with a 30 horsepower, and that was a 6-cylinder, and they didn't make very many of those, and they soon came out with what they called the 4050 in late 1906 and early 1907, and that was the Silver Ghost, or what became the Silver Ghost. But it was known by the company as the 4050 horsepower, and it was 40 because they taxed the cars on horsepower, and that was their taxable horsepower. The 50 was supposedly the actual horsepower that the car put out. Although I think the size of the horses were pretty big compared to what we consider today.
Right, because it's deceptive. It doesn't sound like a lot in an era where we're used to 500 horsepower cars or economy cars that can do 125 miles an hour. But it's really about the torque of these engines.
Yes, the torque is where it's at, because these cars will pull along a 5,000-pound car at about 200 RPM up about a 6 or 7% grade in high gear, which there's not many cars that'll do that. You take a modern car, it can't do that at all.
Right. And smooth and just effortless acceleration, right?
And with the mechanical designs that they had at the time, they were very quiet.
Right.
And that was one of the things that made them popular, was that they were quiet, smooth, and a lot of power.
Tragically, Rolls died very young and very early in the company's history.
Yeah, he died in, I think it was 1910, in an airplane crash. In fact, I think he's credited with being one of the first aviation fatalities.
Yeah, it was a Wright Flyer, if I'm not mistaken.
I think it was, yeah.
And Henry Royce, he went on without Rolls, but as I understand it, his health didn't really hold up.
Not well. There was a man named Claude Johnson who was the general manager of the company, and he's sometimes referred to as the hyphen in Rolls-Royce. And he took the name and the company and pushed forward with it, entered all kinds of sporting events and reliability contests, and really promoted Rolls-Royce to be the name that it became.
And Henry Royce passed away in 1933.
I think that's right.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, now let's talk about your Silver Ghost.
Okay.
Give us a rundown on this car.
Okay, well, this car was sold new to a man named John Burns Fraser in Ottawa, Canada. And he was a prominent guy. He was involved with the lumber business. He was on the board of directors of the Grand Trunk Railroad. He was involved with another group of people that did cross-country power transmission in Canada, and he did very well. And he ordered this car in, I think it was December of 1913, and took delivery on the chassis, I think it was in June of 1914. And they put the body on it, which was built by the Connaught Company in England. He had the car up and through the First World War. After the war, he sent it to the Rolls-Royce factory, which was opened after the war in Springfield, Massachusetts, and put an enclosed drive limousine body on it, which it had on it clear up into the 1990s. And then it was restored at that time, and they built a copy of the original body, which it has on it today.
And how long did he own the car?
He owned the car up through, I think, 1939. And he sold it to a friend, and then that guy sold it to another friend. He drove it in a couple of parades, and then I had a friend in Santa Barbara that bought it. And I think that was 1978, 79, something like that. And that was when I first saw the car. I thought it was a wonderful car, but never dreamed that someday I would own it.
Right.
And then when that man passed away, it went to a member of Parliament in England who was a prominent car guy, and his name was Alan Clark, and he's written a number of books on early cars. And he had it for about 10 years, and he passed away. And then a friend in Connecticut, Doug McGee, got the car, and he's one that had the car restored and the body built like the original and put it back the way you see it today.
And Alan, as I say, I love that you drive the car, and you don't just drive it around the block. You drive it thousands of miles. And you recently got back from one of the Rolls-Royce tours it's an annual event, is that right?
Yes. They have one, and they call it the Holy Ghost Tour. And this year, my wife and I were the chair people on this tour, and we started in Moab, Utah, and we drove about 1,800 miles over 12 days through southern Utah to the Canyon de Chelly in northern Arizona, Lake Powell, up through all the national parks. We did 6 national parks and 6 national monuments and numerous state parks. Driving this car, and we had no mechanical difficulties whatsoever. We had 38 cars on the event. There was one car had a little bit of a dust in the carburetor problem, but with about 10-15 minutes of fussing around, they've cleared that problem up. And then a couple of people had some tire issues. And other than that, it was a successful tour. And with the Silver Ghost group, we generally don't have a trouble trailer. We have usually somebody that comes along with a more modern car or pickup or something to bring an extra can of gas, oil, in this case, drinking water. So everybody was able to keep themselves hydrated as well as the car.
And these are all pre-1927 cars?
Yes.
Okay.
Silver Ghost was built from 1907 to 1926. And they made, I think there's, if I remember right, there's about 7,974 of them built. Not all of them in England.
Right.
There was about 1,900 of them built in Springfield, Massachusetts after the First World War. And the interesting thing about it is out of almost 8,000 cars, they figure that there's somewhere around 20% still survive, which is an incredible survival rate.
Absolutely.
Considering the age of these cars, and that they're almost all 100 years old or more.
And when you consider how many cars were scrapped during World War II and after.
Right, yeah. Well, there were a lot of Rolls-Royces scrapped too, but an awful lot of them from the 1920s were, especially old limousines, were made into utility vehicles like pickup trucks and all kinds of different things like that, because they were extremely reliable, durable engines. They just continued to run. I even remember seeing sometime in the 1950s out in the San Fernando Valley a man that had made a tractor, a wheel tractor, out of a Silver Ghost. And that was a surprise to see that. But I guess it was fairly successful.
Yeah, there were all kinds of strange home-built contraptions back in those days. And of course the doodle bugs, you know about the doodle bugs,
Yes.
the Ford Model Ts and Model As that were
Right.
converted into tractors. So now with these cars, you're sort of at the mercy of the elements no matter what.
True.
But how do you cope with that? How do you manage that?
Well, most of them are open cars, but not all of them. And you know, if it's inclement weather, we have side curtains, which they came with when they were new. If the cars are set up the way they were in the teens and the 20s, they're very comfortable cars. They ride nice, they're quiet, they're smooth. In some ways, they're kind of like driving an old truck, but that's part of the fun of driving them. And
I was going to say
the
that's part
accomplishment of doing almost 2,000 miles in a 100-year-old vehicle, there's a lot of satisfaction and joy in doing that.
Yeah, I was going to say that's part of the charm, is to kind of be exposed to the surroundings.
Right.
Whereas today we're so insulated and closed off from the elements. Obviously the interior must be very comfortable. I mean, they're basically a couple of Churchill sofas in there.
Well, they are. They're very comfortable. And with the top down, you get the feel of the scenery and the element that's in your surroundings. And while you have the wind in your face a little bit, and you feel the road a little bit more, that's part of the charm of driving these cars, especially in Utah where the scenery is so spectacular. We went on roads, a few places where they were dirt, but you know, these cars were designed to drive on dirt roads anyway, and they just go.
Yeah, there wasn't much of a road system when this car was new.
Not really, not by comparison to modern standards, that's for sure.
How many miles do you think you've put on your car?
Well, on this car, since we've owned it, I know I've put over 30,000 miles on it.
That's fantastic. Now you've passed on the Rolls-Royce bug to your daughter Ivy.
Yes.
Was she on the tour with you?
Yes, she was. In fact, she designed the tour book that we used, and we passed out to all of our participants. So with the directions, a little bit of the history of the area, the geology, everything about it that she could think of, she put in the book. So people were well informed of where they were and what they were doing.
Terrific. Well, we're going to speak to Ivy in just a minute, but Alan, I want to thank you for sharing your memories of the car and what it's like to own and drive and enjoy. Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for coming.
Hi there, Ivy.
Hi.
Your car is beautiful too.
Thank you.
Tell us about it.
It's a 1926 Pall Mall Tourer built in Springfield, Massachusetts.
Now, was Pall Mall the coach builder, or was that the body style?
That's the body style. Merrimack is the coach builder.
Merrimack, okay. And so many coach builders, it's hard to keep track of them all.
Yes, which actually makes the cars really interesting, is that each car kind of has a unique take on it with the body styles.
Yeah, it's interesting. And would it be right to call this car a Phaeton?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah, it's an odd term. We don't, people don't really know that, but when you've got a cowl between the front and rear seats,
Yes.
that's basically a Phaeton.
Yes.
Yeah. Are there any modifications?
No, I mean, the car's all original apart from the Optima battery that I run.
It definitely,
Very
battery technology's
reliable.
come a long way since the car was built.
Yes, you cannot have an original battery on this car, but
Do you have problems keeping it charged or maintaining a charge?
no, it works great.
Awesome. So you grew up around these cars. What was that like? I mean, it's not everyone gets that opportunity.
I think that my earliest memory is sitting in the back of a car playing, but I think like the smell of the cars is like my strongest memory, which is actually a very fond smell to me now.
Absolutely. There's nothing like that smell of an old car. A little bit of decay, a little bit of sort of mellow age, I guess you'd say.
Old leather,
I love
just oil and exhaust.
Yeah, terrific. They're very sensory. Now, did you learn to drive on a normal car and then on a?
Yes. I didn't first learn how to drive in an old car.
Right.
I definitely learned on a modern car. But I did learn how to drive Rolls-Royces. In fact, that was really like my first attempt at like learning how to drive an older vehicle and understanding how they work and operate. And an intense experience getting behind a car of that size and weight and value to learn how to drive. But it actually they're really easy cars to drive. I mean, considering what the spectrum is. And so didn't take too long. My dad was pretty good. I mean, he's such an incredible driver. He doesn't miss a shift. So it's really kind of difficult in some ways to drive with him because he is a flawless driver and he can get behind any car and within a couple minutes. I mean, a car that most people would grind gears through, he could just easily shift. So there's like an intimidation factor in the way he explains things. It's so simple.
And your dad's a patient guy too.
Yeah, he's very patient.
Yeah.
He's very patient.
So somewhere down the line, you decided you wanted one of your own?
Yes. Well, my dad offered me the opportunity. He was like, look, I've come across this car. It actually wasn't this car. It was a 1923 Pall Mall. And it was going up for auction at this obscure auction that he came across that had no advertising. And he was like, I think this thing's just going to pop up and no one knows about it. And it's like, I think we should get this car. I think you should get this car, because he knew that I was beginning to get interested in the hobby. I still lived back east, but I was starting to get more involved when there was a big event or a cool tour. And so he just thought it was a great opportunity. I jumped on it. It was an amazing car. And then we ended up selling that car. And then a widow contacted my father and was like, I have this car. I don't know if you're interested, but I need to sell it. And he thought this was a great car because it had low mileage on it. I think it only had 32,000 original miles on this car. And then he thought, this is a good opportunity. This is a great running vehicle. This is perfect for driving. And I think you should get it. So I got this car, and this has been my car ever since for the last 10 or 12 years.
What's the history on the car?
So the history on the car, I don't know all the hands it passed, but the original owner had the last name Caperton. and it was in Kentucky, and it was weird because my dad's like, well, I know a Caperton in Kentucky. So he contacted his friend and was like, do you know anything about this vehicle? Did you have a relative that owned it? And he was like, my father owned that car, and I remember riding in it as a child. So it was like a small world.
Well, I think it's largely true of Rolls-Royce and other certain marks that the owner history is as interesting as the car
That's
itself.
what makes it fascinating is who's owned these cars and where they've been, because most of these cars are more well-traveled than the average person.
Yes.
They've been all over the world. They've been in multiple hands, and they've seen a lot.
Right. And of course, let's not even get into the Maharajas.
Oh, yeah.
And all of the Rolls-Royce cars that they owned, and the outlandish bodywork on them.
Yes, which is a whole nother,
Well, your car is clearly, I don't know if it's fair to say, a generation ahead of your father's.
Yes.
A much more modern-looking car.
Yes, and it's 3-speed, and, it's pretty practical. I mean, you just get it into third, and it drives.
Right. And it looks like your car would have had incandescent headlamps from the factory versus the carbide lamps that your dad's would have had.
Yeah, I believe so.
Alan, is that right?
Rolls-Royce was one of the first companies to offer electric lights on a car. But the interesting thing about that is they didn't offer an electric starter until after the First World War,
Right.
where most other cars had electric starters. Rolls-Royces were still hand cranked.
Interesting. Cadillac was the first, right?
Well,
They claimed to be the first.
they claimed to be the first.
Yeah.
There were others at about the same time.
I see. Even though it looks a lot more modern than your father's car, do they drive largely the same, or?
I'd have to say they definitely drive differently, and from what I've told, obviously I haven't had the experience of driving every Silver Ghost, but each one kind of has its own personality, and they all kind of drive a little differently. My dad's car definitely actually feels more powerful, and it shifts smoother. The first car that I owned, it was a gorgeous car. It had incredible brakes, which was nice. But that thing was so tricky to shift. And when I'd let somebody drive it, I was like, there's a little system to how you have to shift this thing. So
Tell us about that.
Well, there's just first is you take your time into first, you jam it into second, and then you count to 2, and then you put it into 3. So it's there's a weird little kind of quirkiness to it.
Ivy, thanks for coming on the show and having me in. And Alan, who's sitting there off camera, appreciate your hospitality today.
My pleasure.
Yeah, it was great having you.